B. The badly paid strata of the British industrial class. During the cotton famine of 1862, Dr. Smith was charged by the Privy Council with an inquiry into the conditions of nourishment of the distressed operatives in Lancashire and Cheshire. His observations during many preceding years had led him to the conclusion that, quote, to avert starvation diseases, unquote, the daily food of an average woman ought to contain at least 3,900 grains of carbon with 180 grains of nitrogen. Commenting, we of course don't use those kinds of measurements to discuss nutrition anymore, but a grain is an old measure of weight, and here carbon and nitrogen can be seen roughly as stand-ins for what we would call carbohydrates and protein today. Continuing. The daily food of an average man, at least 4,300 grains of carbon, with 200 grains of nitrogen. For women, about the same quantity of nutritive elements as are contained in 2 pounds of good wheaten bread. For men, 1/9 more. For the weekly average of adult men and women, at least 28,600 grains of carbon and 1,330 grains of nitrogen. His calculation was practically confirmed in a surprising manner by its agreement with the miserable quantity of nourishment to which want had forced down the consumption of the cotton operatives. This was, in December 1862, 29,211 grains of carbon and 1,295 grains of nitrogen weekly. In the year 1863, the Privy Council ordered an inquiry into the state of distress of the worst nourished part of the English working class. Dr. Simon, medical officer to the Privy Council, chose for this work the above-mentioned Dr. Smith. His inquiry ranges on the one hand over the agricultural laborers, on the other over silk weavers, needlewomen, kid glovers, stocking weavers, glove weavers, and shoemakers. The latter categories are, with the exception of the stocking weavers, exclusively town dwellers. It was made a rule in the inquiry to select in each category the most healthy families and those comparatively in the best circumstances. As a general result, it was found that, quote, in only one of the examined classes of indoor operatives did the average nitrogen supply just exceed, while in another it nearly reached, the estimated standard of bare sufficiency, i.e. sufficient to avert starvation diseases, and that in 2 classes there was defect, in one a very large defect of both nitrogen and carbon. Moreover, as regards the examined families of the agricultural population, it appeared that more than 1/5 were with less than the estimated sufficiency of carbonaceous food, that more than 1/3 were with less than the estimated sufficiency of nitrogenous food, and that in 3 counties, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, and Somersetshire, insufficiency of nitrogenous food was the average local diet. That's quoting the Public Health 6 Report, 1864. Among the agricultural laborers, those of England, the wealthiest part of the United Kingdom, were the worst fed. The insufficiency of food among the agricultural laborers fell, as a rule, chiefly on the women and children, for, quote, the man must eat to do his work, unquote. Still greater penury ravaged the town workers examined. Quote, they are so ill-fed that assuredly among them there must be many cases of severe and injurious privation, unquote. Privation of the capitalist all this, i.e. abstinence from paying for the means of subsistence absolutely necessary for the mere vegetation of his hands. The following table shows the conditions of nourishment of the above-named categories of purely town-dwelling workpeople as compared with the minimum assumed by Dr. Smith and with the food allowance of the cotton operatives during the time of their greatest distress. And again, this chart is given in terms of grains of carbon and nitrogen, as that's not going to mean anything to anyone. I'm not going to read them out. But basically, the minimum quantity was 28,600 for carbon and 1,330 for nitrogen. And basically, all the categories are just barely at or below those numbers. 1/2 or 60/125 of the industrial labor categories investigated had absolutely no beer, 28% no milk. And commenting, remember that people actually got nourishment from beer at this point. Continuing, the weekly average of the liquid means of nourishment in the families varied from 7 ounces in the needlewomen to 24 3/4 ounces in the stocking makers. The majority of those who did not obtain milk were needlewomen in London. The quantity of breadstuffs consumed weekly varied from 7 3/4 pounds for the needlewomen to 11.5 pounds for the shoemakers, and gave a total average of 9.9 pounds per adult weekly. Sugar, treacle, etc., varied from 4 ounces weekly for the kid glovers to 11 ounces for the stocking makers, and the total average per week for all categories was 8 ounces per adult weekly. Total weekly average of butter and other fat, etc., 5 ounces per adult. The weekly average of meat, such as bacon, etc., varied from 7¼ ounces for the silk weavers to 18¼ ounces for the kid glovers. Total average for the different categories, 13.6 ounces. The weekly cost of food per adult gave the following average figures. Silk weavers, 2 shillings 2½ pence. Needlewomen, 2 shillings 7 pence. Kid glovers, 2 shillings 9½ pence. Shoemakers, 2 shillings 7¾ pence. Stocking weavers, 2 shillings 6¼ pence. For the silk weavers of Macclesfield, the average was only 1 shilling 8½ pence. The worst categories were the needlewomen, silk weavers, and kid glovers. Of these facts, Dr. Simon, in his General Health Report, says, quote, that cases are innumerable in which defective diet is the cause or the aggravator of disease can be affirmed by anyone who is conversant with poor law medical practice or with the wards and outpatient rooms of hospitals. Yet, in this point of view, there is, in my opinion, a very important sanitary context to be added. It must be remembered that privation of food is very reluctantly born, and that, as a rule, great poorness of diet will only come when other privations have preceded it. Long before insufficiency of diet is a matter of hygienic concern, long before the physiologist would think of counting the grains of nitrogen and carbon which intervene between life and starvation, the household will have been utterly destitute of material comfort. Clothing and fuel will have been even scantier than food. Against inclemencies of weather, there will have been no adequate protection. Dwelling space will have been stinted to the degree in which overcrowding produces or increases disease. Of household utensils and furniture, there will have been scarcely any. Even cleanliness will have been found costly or difficult, and if there still be self-respectful endeavors to maintain it, every such endeavor will represent additional pangs of hunger. The home, too, will be where shelter can be cheapest bought, in quarters where commonly there is least fruit of sanitary supervision, least drainage, least scavenging, least suppression of public nuisances, least or worst water supply, and, if in town, least light and air. Such are the sanitary dangers to which poverty is almost certainly exposed when it is poverty enough to imply scantiness of food. And while the sum of them is of terrible magnitude against life, the mere scantiness of food is in itself of very serious moment. These are painful reflections, especially when it is remembered that the poverty to which they advert is not the deserved poverty of idleness. In all cases, it is the poverty of working populations. Indeed, as regards the indoor operatives, the work which obtains the scanty pittance of food is for the most part excessively prolonged. Yet evidently it is only in a qualified sense that the work can be deemed self-supporting. And on a very large scale, the nominal self-support can be only a circuit, longer or shorter, to pauperism." Unquote. The intimate connection between the pangs of hunger of the most industrious layers of the working class and the extravagant consumption, coarse or refined, of the rich, for which capitalist accumulation is the basis, reveals itself only when the economic laws are known. It is otherwise with the housing of the poor. Every unprejudiced observer sees that the greater the centralization of the means of production, the greater is the corresponding heaping together of the laborers within a given space, that therefore the swifter capitalistic accumulation, the more miserable are the dwellings of the working people. Quote-unquote improvements of towns, accompanying the increase of wealth by the demolition of badly built quarters, the erection of palaces for banks, warehouses, etc., the widening of streets for business traffic, for the carriages of luxury, and for the introduction of tramways, etc., drive away the poor into even worse and more crowded hiding places. On the other hand, everyone knows that the dearness of dwellings is an inverse ratio to their excellence, and that the mines of misery are exploited by house speculators with more profit or less cost than ever were the mines of Potosi. Comment: I'm so glad this isn't the case anymore, aren't you? Continuing. The antagonistic character of capitalist accumulation, and therefore of the capitalistic relations of property generally, is here so evident that even the official English reports on this subject teem with heterodox onslaughts on, quote, property and its rights. Footnote quoting S. Lang, in no particular have the rights of persons been so avowedly and shamefully sacrificed to the rights of property, in as regard to the lodging of the laboring class. Every large town may be looked upon as a place of human sacrifice, a shrine where thousands pass yearly through the fire as offerings to the Moloch of avarice. Back to the main text. With the development of industry, with the accumulation of capital, with the growth and, quote, improvement of towns, the evil makes such progress that the mere fear of contagious diseases, which do not spare even so-called respectability, brought into existence from 1847 to 64 no less than 10 acts of parliament on sanitation, and that the frightened bourgeois in some towns, like Liverpool, Glasgow, etc., took strenuous measures through their municipalities. Nevertheless, Dr. Simon, in his report of 1865, says, quote, "Generally speaking, it may be said that the evils are uncontrolled in England," unquote. By order of the Privy Council in 1864, an inquiry was made into the conditions of the housing of the agricultural laborers, in 1865 of the poorer classes in the towns. The results of the admirable work of Dr. Julian Hunter are to be found in the 7th, 1865, and 8th, 1866 reports on public health. To the agricultural laborers I shall come later. On the condition of town dwellings, I quote, as preliminary, a general remark of Dr. Simon, quote, "Although my official point of view is one exclusively physical, common humanity requires that the other aspect of this evil should not be ignored. In its higher degrees, it," meaning overcrowding, "almost necessarily involves such negation of all delicacy, such unclean confusion of bodies and bodily functions, such exposure of animal and sexual nakedness as is rather bestial than human. To be subject to these influences is a degradation which must become deeper and deeper for those on whom it continues to work. To children who are born under its curse, it must often be a very baptism into infamy. And beyond all measure hopeless is the wish that persons thus circumstanced should ever in other respects aspire to that atmosphere of civilization which has its essence in physical and moral cleanliness," unquote. London takes the first place in overcrowded habitations, absolutely unfit for human beings. Quote, "He feels clear," says Dr. Hunter, quote, "on 2 points. First, that there are about 20 large colonies in London, of about 10,000 persons each, whose miserable condition exceeds almost anything he has seen elsewhere in England, and is almost entirely the result of their bad house accommodation. And second, that the crowded and dilapidated condition of the houses of these colonies is much worse than was the case 20 years ago. Footnote, with reference to children in these colonies, Dr. Hunter says, quote, "People are not now alive to tell us how children were brought up before this age of dense agglomerations of poor began, and he would be a rash prophet who should tell us what future behavior is to be expected from the present growth of children, who, under circumstances probably never before paralleled in this country, are now completing their education for future practice as dangerous classes, by sitting up half the night with persons of every age, half naked, drunken, obscene, and quarrelsome." Back to the main text. Quote, "It is not too much to say that life in parts of London and Newcastle is infernal," unquote. Further, the better off part of the working class, together with the small shopkeepers and other elements of the lower middle class, falls in London more and more under the curse of these vile conditions of dwelling, in proportion as so-called improvements, and with them the demolition of old streets and houses, advance, as factories and the afflux of human beings grow in the metropolis, and finally as house rents rise with the ground rents. Quoting the report of the Officer of Health of St. Martin's in the Fields, 1865, rents have become so heavy that few laboring men can afford more than one room, unquote. There is almost no house property in London that is not overburdened with a number of middlemen, for the price of land in London is always very high in comparison with its yearly revenue, and therefore every buyer speculates on getting rid of it again at a jury price, the expropriation valuation fixed by jurymen, or on pocketing an extraordinary increase of value arising from the neighborhood of some large establishment. As a consequence of this, there is a regular trade in the purchase of so-called fag-ends of leases. Quote, "Gentlemen in this business may be fairly expected to do as they do, get all they can from the tenants while they have them, and leave as little as they can for their successors." That's quoting the Public Health 8th Report, 1866. The rents are weekly, and these gentlemen run no risk. In consequence of the making of railroads in the city, quote, "The spectacle has lately been seen in the east of London of a number of families wandering about some Saturday night with their scanty worldly goods on their backs, without any resting place but the workhouse," unquote. The workhouses are already overcrowded, and the improvements already sanctioned by Parliament are only just begun. If laborers are driven away by the demolition of their old houses, they do not leave their old parish, or at most they settle down on its borders as near as they can get to it. Quote, "They try, of course, to remain as near as possible to their workshops. The inhabitants do not go beyond the same or the next parish, parting their two-room tenements into single rooms and crowding even those. Even at an advanced rent, the people who are displaced will hardly be able to get an accommodation as good as the meager one they've left. Half the workmen of the Strand walked 2 miles to their work," unquote. This same Strand, a main thoroughfare which gives strangers an imposing idea of the wealth of London, may serve as an example of the packing together of human beings in that town. In one of its parishes, the Officer of Health reckoned 581 persons per acre, although half the width of the Thames was reckoned in. It will be self-understood that every sanitary measure, which, as has been the case hitherto in London, hunts the laborers from one quarter by demolishing uninhabitable houses, serves only to crowd them together yet more closely in another. Quote, either, says Dr. Hunter, the whole proceeding will of necessity stop as an absurdity, or the public compassion, Marx adds an exclamation point, be effectually aroused to the obligation which may now be without exaggeration called national, of supplying cover to those who by reason of their having no capital cannot provide it for themselves, though they can by periodical payments reward those who will provide it for them. Unquote. Admire this capitalistic justice. The owner of land, of houses, the businessman, when expropriated by so-called improvements such as railroads, the building of new streets, etc., not only receives full indemnity, he must, according to law, human and divine, be comforted for his enforced abstinence over and above this by a thumping profit. The laborer, with his wife and child and chattels, is thrown out into the street, and if he crowds in too large numbers toward quarters of the town where the vestries insist on decency, he is prosecuted in the name of sanitation. Except London, there was at the beginning of the 19th century no single town in England of 100,000 inhabitants. Only 5 had more than 50,000. Now, there are 28 towns with more than 50,000 inhabitants. Quote, the result of this change is not only that the class of town people is enormously increased, but the old, close-packed little towns are now centers, built round on every side, open nowhere to air, and being no longer agreeable to the rich are abandoned by them for the pleasanter outskirts. The successors of these rich are occupying the larger houses at the rate of a family to each room, and find accommodation for 2 or 3 lodgers, and a population for which the houses were not intended and quite unfit has been created, whose surroundings are truly degrading to the adults and ruinous to the children. Unquote. The more rapidly capital accumulates in an industrial or commercial town, the more rapidly flows the stream of exploitable human material, the more miserable are the improved dwellings of the laborers. Newcastle-on-Tyne, as the center of a coal and iron district of growing productiveness, takes the next place after London in the housing inferno. Not less than 34,000 persons live there in single rooms. Because of their absolute danger to the community, houses in great numbers have lately been destroyed by the authorities in Newcastle and Gateshead. The building of new houses progresses very slowly, business very quickly. The town was, therefore, in 1865, more full than ever. Scarcely a room was to let. Dr. Embleton of the Newcastle Fever Hospital says, quote, there can be little doubt that the great cause of the continuance and spread of the typhus has been the overcrowding of human beings, and the uncleanliness of their dwellings. The rooms, in which laborers in many cases live, are situated in confined and unwholesome yards or courts, and space for light, air, and cleanliness are models of insufficiency and insalubrity, and a disgrace to any civilized community. In them men, women, and children lie at night huddled together, and as regards the men, the night shift succeed the day shift, and the day shift the night shift, in unbroken series for some time together, the beds having scarcely time to cool, the whole house badly supplied with water, and worse with privies, dirty, unventilated, and pestiferous. Unquote. The price per week of such lodgings ranges from 8d. to 3 shillings. Quote, the town of Newcastle-on-Tyne, says Dr. Hunter, contains a sample of the finest tribe of our countrymen, often sunk by external circumstances of house and street into an almost savage degradation. Unquote. As a result of the ebbing and flowing of capital and labor, the state of the dwellings of an industrial town may today be bearable, tomorrow hideous, or the aedileship of the town may have pulled itself together for the removal of the most shocking abuses. Tomorrow, like a swarm of locusts, come crowding in masses of ragged Irishmen or decayed English agricultural laborers. They are stowed away in cellars and lofts, or the hitherto respectable laborer's dwelling is transformed into a lodging house whose personnel changes as quickly as the billets in the 30 Years' War. Example, Bradford in Yorkshire. There, the municipal Philistine was just busied with urban improvements. Besides, there were still in Bradford, in 1861, 1,751 uninhabited houses. But now comes that revival of trade, which the mildly liberal Mr. Forster, the Negro's friend, recently crowed over with so much grace. With the revival of trade came, of course, an overflow from the waves of the ever-fluctuating reserve army, or relative surplus population. The frightful cellar habitations and rooms registered in the list, which Dr. Hunter obtained from the agent of an insurance company, were for the most part inhabited by well-paid laborers. And there's a footnote there with the actual list from the collecting agent, which I'll put on the screen. It has about 24 addresses, and for each address, it says whether it's a room or a cellar where people are staying, and there's anywhere from 6 or 7 people up to 16 or 18. In one case of there being 2 rooms for rent, there were 26 people living there. Back to the main text. They declared that they would willingly pay for better dwellings if they were to be had. Meanwhile, they become degraded. They fall ill, one and all, whilst the mildly liberal Forster, MP, sheds tears over the blessings of free trade, and the profits of the eminent men of Bradford who deal in worsted. In the report of September 1865, Dr. Bell, one of the poor law doctors of Bradford, ascribes the frightful mortality of fever patients in his district to the nature of their dwellings. Quote, "In one small cellar, measuring 1,500 cubic feet, there are 10 persons. Vincent Street, Green Air Place, and the Lays include 223 houses having 1,450 inhabitants, 435 beds, and 36 privies. The beds, and in that term I include any roll of dirty old rags, or an armful of shavings, have an average of 3.3 persons to each. Many have 5 and 6 persons to each, and some people, I'm told, are absolutely without beds. They sleep in their ordinary clothes on the bare boards, young men and women, married and unmarried altogether. I need scarcely add that many of these dwellings are dark, damp, dirty, stinking holes, utterly unfit for human habitation. They are the centers from which disease and death are distributed amongst those in better circumstances, who have allowed them thus to fester in our midst." Unquote. Bristol takes the 3rd place after London in the misery of its dwellings. Quote, "Bristol, where the blankest poverty and domestic misery abound, in the wealthiest town of Europe." Unquote.